For the last couple of weeks, agricultural commodities, in particular corn and wheat, have had a really rough go of it. And this flies in the face of the narrative of the geopolitical risk and the pending food shortages and the fertilizer story that you're all familiar with. And then last week, I got a message from Rich S. on my Discord server suggesting that I check out a channel called Grain Markets and Other Stuff, which is run by Joe Vaclavik of StandardGrain.com. This is part one of my interview with Joe, where we get into what's going on with these agricultural commodities recently and where they might be going from here. What's up, guys? I'm nobody special, and I'm very fortunate today. I have Joe Vaclavik from Grain and Other Stuff on YouTube channel, Grain Markets and Other Stuff on YouTube. Joe, thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
I was recommended on my Discord server to check out your channel, Grain Markets and Other Stuff, because I had some guys were asking. I've been following the corn trade in particular, but also wheat, really since last fall, since the fertilizer story got spun up. And one of my viewers recommended your channel, and I went over there and looked, and I was blown away. Really fantastic detail over there.
Thank
And
you.
you've been covering the grain markets pretty closely. We had this big run up in March.
Yep.
Obviously, Eastern Europe played a big role in that. The trade has come down now. I mean, overall, is it your impression that the grain trade is that done for this year, or do you think that's still a developing story?
It depends on a lot of things. So if this were a normal year, and say we didn't have the Russia Ukraine Black Sea issue going on, in a normal year, you would look for some sort of what we'd call a seasonal high in May or June. Typically what happens in regard to our summer crops, like the corn and soybean crops, as an example. So those crops are planted in the spring, right? Typically around this time of year, the market will add some premium during planting and maybe ahead of the time that the crops reach maturity, just because we don't really know what the acreage is. We don't know what the yield's going to be. We don't know how big the crops are going to be. It's once we start to figure out that A, the crop has been planted, and two, it's not going to be a disaster, that they start to remove some of that premium in the markets. So if you go back over the last 30 years, your average high on the calendar in the corn market, as an example, is usually like June 8th or 9th, 10th, somewhere in that time frame. And that's an average. It can be before that or after that. But a lot of times that's when you'll see your calendar year peak. And then once we get an idea of what the crop is, it's not a disaster, it's going to be okay, they'll start to take some premium out. I think we've started to see some of that here this year, but it's still early. And a lot of the summer crops were planted late. A lot of the corn crop was planted late this year. There's still some planting ongoing here, as a matter of fact. So we've seen the market take some premium out, but there's still a potential for what I would call like a crop scare event or a weather rally. Like if you come in on, a Sunday afternoon or Sunday night to open the grain markets, and all of a sudden the weather forecast shifts toward hot and dry, the markets will rally on that. And they could post new highs as late as 4th of July weekend or mid-July, even into August, depending on, the given year. So there's still opportunity for that sort of thing. But generally speaking, in a normal year, you'd look for some sort of seasonal high around this time of year, really.
So we've got this seasonality going. I heard a lot in
Mhm.
the spring that, the cold and wet conditions drove a lot of delayed plantings. Have we pivoted to the point where the crop wants the colder, wetter conditions, where now, most of the planting is done? So we want that moisture now. Or are we into that point? Because it seemed like the market was crying for drier conditions earlier in May, and now it seems to be rallying on wetter conditions.
Yeah, as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, rain was a bad thing when it came to the crop and crop potential, because plantings were delayed, especially in places like, say, the U.S. Northern Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Northern Iowa, Southern Minnesota, those sort of places. Now, the vast majority of what has been planted in regard to corn is done. I mean, there's not going to be a whole lot more corn planting here. So what's done is in regard to planting. And I think that rain is now a good thing in regard to crop prospects, and a negative in regard to the markets. So the way it looks right now, we've got kind of a benign or even bearish looking forecast into, say, the middle part of June, meaning that we've got plenty of rain coming, cooler temperatures, generally speaking. Forecasts can turn on a dime, though. I've seen it 100 times where, you may go home on Friday afternoon and things look great, and then all of a sudden on Sunday, there's some hot and dry stuff on the maps, and the markets take notice very quickly. So it's always kind of a fluid situation when it comes to weather this time of year. But the planting season, yeah, in regard to corn, is about wrapped up. There's going to be some corn acreage lost. I'll put it this way, acreage in corn that farmers intended to plant in places like North Dakota in particular, it's not going to be planted. I do think, however, that maybe you picked up some corn acreage versus earlier intentions elsewhere, because the corn market did such a fantastic job of rallying to the upside during that pre-planting window. I think some farmers may have been incentivized to increase acreage a little bit.
Yeah, so we got the prospective planting report a few months ago, and I remember the one data point that 4 million acres it was anticipated fewer of corn was going to be
Yeah.
planted this year. That you were going to have this big shift from corn over to soybeans. Um, you think the higher price, if I'm understanding you right, you're saying the higher prices in corn may have brought some of those acres back?
One thing that a lot of people will watch is like the corn versus soybean ratio. They'll watch new crop corn prices versus new crop soybean prices and how that relationship looks, because acreage will move between those two crops from year to year based on that ratio. So when USDA puts out that planting intentions report, what they do is they survey farmers during the first part of March before planting has occurred. They survey farmers during March, and then the survey results are what we see at the end of March in that intentions report. That report is not good. It's not a good report. They don't survey enough farmers. The survey responses are absolutely terrible. So it's a report that is historically very much inaccurate. It's at the end of June when we see the final, or not the final, but the planted acreage report from USDA, where we see what was actually planted, which is much more accurate than the intentions. So those intentions may have very well changed, because corn rallied not only in a vacuum, but also versus soybeans on a ratio basis. And that's something that I think could have pulled some acreage maybe out of soybeans and into corn versus intentions, after those surveys were taken.
Excellent. Okay. Now, another thing regarding the acreage and corn, I saw an article about a week ago. It was in Reuters by Karen Braun saying, avoid a potential misread on U.S. planting pace in delayed states. And the gist of the article is that the way the data is collected in these crop progress reports is that local experts are surveyed based on what they see and hear on the ground, and they report how much is in the ground versus how much is intended to be in the ground.
Yeah.
And it sounded like she was suggesting that farmers opting to take prevent plant or crop insurance could be misinterpreted as planted corn in these progress reports. Have you ever seen anything like that? Is that a possibility right now?
I wouldn't rule it out. I tend to not read too much into the progress reports. What you've got to do is kind of read between the lines and try to figure out what's going on in real time versus what USDA said. Because like I told you in the last question, I mean, I think those intentions are wrong to begin with. I mean, I think that there's a huge degree of probability that there was something very, very off in those reports to begin with. So you're trying to track the progress of intended acres that are wrong to begin with. It's really, really tricky to do. So like my opinion right now would be that, we lost acres in North Dakota. We may have lost a few corn acres in Minnesota. Some of those acres might go to prevent plant. Some of those acres might be switched to soybeans, maybe to spring wheat, but then maybe in other places where the weather was okay, generally speaking, maybe in Illinois or Iowa or Indiana or Nebraska, maybe you're going to see more corn acres versus original intentions. So there's so many moving parts. The acreage thing is one of the hardest things to predict. Like we have these reports that come out at the end of June, and all the analysts are going to put out their guesses ahead of the reports, and every single one of them is going to be wrong. There's going to be something that comes out of nowhere and nobody sees it, and there's going to be a miss in corn acreage by 1 million or 2 million, or a miss in soybeans by 1 million or 2 million. It happens almost every year, and if there was ever a year for some sort of big miss, it would be this year, because of not just because of the price movements, but because of fertilizer and input costs and inflation and everything else that's going on in the world. I think that the degree of uncertainty is larger than normal even.
Well, you touched on fertilizer there for a minute, so let's stick with that one because that hit really in last fall. We
Mm-hmm.
saw these prices start to skyrocket. I read a lot of stories that some farmers had locked in the prices and some had been holding out hoping that they would come back down from the spring.
Yeah.
And I know this is kind of a forward, a few months out. Most guys tend to lock in their prices early. Have we seen the impact of this fertilizer price spike in the fields yet, or is this still something that's 6 months to a year out from actually affecting our crop yields?
The impact to this point has been acres. I mean, corn acres would have been 93, 94 million if it had not been for this spike in input costs, which was fertilizer was your biggest contributing factor when it comes to corn. So when it comes to like crops, like, corn and soybeans are two big crops that are going to fight for acres every year throughout, the Corn Belt in the Midwest and places like that. Corn is a fertilizer intensive crop. They use a lot of nitrogen. They don't need to do that in soybeans. So I think it's for that reason that's where you have seen the impact to this point. I don't think anybody who is planting corn who bought the fertilizer, I don't know that they're going to skimp on fertilizer. I don't know that it's going to have a big impact on yields. That's not the way that I'm reading it. I'm reading it as more something that impacted the acreage mix more than anything. I still think we've got all the potential in the world for really good corn yields this year. It's just that it's going to be on acreage that is probably reduced versus last year. Maybe it's not as low as March intentions, but again, the acreage thing is a guessing game.
So it comes down to acreage more so than a lot of these other factors like
Uh,
fertilizer prices.
no, I think that fertilizer is, I think in regard to this year specifically, I don't think it affects the yields. I think it affects the acreage. So it does affect overall production in that I think corn acres were lost because of the fertilizer prices. I don't think it affects yields though. I think that farmers are going to use the fertilizer that they have. I think the guys who planted corn, I think they have enough to fulfill their needs for this growing season, put it that way.
And on this, for that same token, we're starting to see rumors of diesel shortages, of DEF
Yeah.
shortages. Are we talking the same thing where that probably, do you see that having an impact in what comes out of the fields this year?
No, fuel is not a huge line item necessarily in the budgets for most farms. It has an impact though. I mean, what it does is it makes the cost of production higher. I mean, because you need to run your planters, you need to run your combines. Some farmers, depending on their location, are running semi trucks like every day of the week, moving grain. So it affects your cost of production on a per acre, per bushel basis. I don't think it's going to have much of an impact on production. What it'll do is it will hurt the farmer's bottom line, and that's going to be across every crop. I mean, it doesn't matter what you plant. I mean, it's going to cost you the same amount in fuel to plant and harvest that crop, generally speaking. So it's just it's something that's added to the high input costs from the budgets that I've seen. And a friend of mine, his name's Chris Barron. He's got a podcast. It's called AgView, the AgView Pitch. Me and him did an episode on corn input costs. I think it was actually on my podcast, maybe 2-3 months ago. And the general conclusion that we came to is that the cost of production in corn went up 20% year over year from 21 to 22, which is a phenomenal rise. Like we've never seen an increase like that in production costs. A lot of it was fertilizer, but it was other things too. I mean, everything from machinery costs are up, cash rents are up, fuels are up. I mean, there's not anything that's down. So everything is up drastically, and that cost of production going up 20 cents. I mean, you basically went from like, it costs a guy $4 a bushel to grow corn. Now your break even's like $5 or above, depending on the situation and the particular operation. It's really a game-changing deal.
So let's shift gears a little bit over towards wheat. My moderator Mish has been on a road trip through the heartland, and in particular, he noticed Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Those states in particular, he's seen a lot of the fields where, knee high at best, 18-inch winter
Yeah.
wheat. And he sent me a couple of numbers right before we started. He's saying those states, they're estimating 170 million bushels lost just in those three states from the winter wheat crop. And I'm also hearing that the spring wheat crop really doesn't look like it's going to offset anything. So what's your outlook for wheat at this point in light of what's going on here in the States?
So keep in mind, in the US, we grow several different classes of wheat. The wheat that we grow the most of is hard red winter wheat. That's what's grown in the Southern Plains, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma into Nebraska, South Dakota. That HRW crop in the Southern Plains, I think USDA projected will be the smallest HRW crop since 1963. So we've done nothing to increase acreage in wheat. Other crops have become more attractive. Wheat's really unpredictable when it comes to yield. So there's going to be a lot of abandonment. There's going to be poor yields. The crop was rated, the winter wheat crop in total, which includes the SRW crop, which is grown in the Midwest, in Illinois and Indiana, places like that. All winter wheat ratings combined were only 29% good to excellent, which I don't know what the Porterberry poor number was, but it's really high. So yeah, the winter wheat crop here in the United States is in bad shape, and it's not going to get any better. I mean, any rains at this point in time, it's too little too late. We needed those rains 2 months ago. So they're not going to help now. Spring wheat still has a real chance. Spring wheat is grown in North Dakota, in Canada, in Montana, in Western Minnesota, places like that. And I think we're actually going to see additional spring wheat acreage versus March intentions. A lot of areas that can't plant corn in the north, like we discussed earlier, they're instead of going to prevent plant, and some of them might go to prevent plant, they could also just switch and plant spring wheat instead. And the prices are really attractive. I mean, they make money, so there's still time for farmers in those areas to plant spring wheat. The spring wheat crop in the north last year, in the northern plains and in Canada, was a disaster. They had a significant drought that remains in place in some areas. I would say that spring wheat crop prospects actually look at this very moment probably a hell of a lot better than they were last year.
So there you have it, folks. There's a little bit of seasonality going on in agricultural markets right now, and that's to be expected. Weather is still a big variable. And of course, it is the 2020s, so there are some other circumstances right now that could affect grain prices from here. And we'll get into that in part 2, where we talk about geopolitical risk and other circumstances that are affecting agricultural markets. And I just want to remind you, you can check out Joe's work. There are links down below to grain markets and other stuff, Joe's channel on YouTube, and also standardgrain.com, where you can find his podcast and his newsletter. Till next time, live small and dream big.